Let me tell you about the day Darlene Caldwell knocked on my front door at 7:30 in the morning, in the middle of a snowstorm, to tell me that my rubber snow mat was a violation of HOA policy. Not a crack in my foundation, not an overgrown tree threatening the power lines, not even a fence painted the wrong shade of beige. A rubber mat. The kind you buy at any hardware store for $12. The kind that sits in front of your door so people don't slip on ice and crack their skulls open. That mat, according to Darlene Caldwell, required prior written approval from the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association before it could legally rest on my front stoop. I stood there in my bathrobe holding a mug of coffee, watching snowflakes collect on Darlene's enormous puffy coat, and I remember thinking, this woman has entirely too much time on her hands. That was the beginning. It got a whole lot worse before it got better. But by the time everything shook out, Darlene Caldwell wasn't going to be bothering anyone in Maplewood Ridge for a very long time. Here's how it all went down. I moved into Maplewood Ridge about 4 years before any of this happened. It's a pretty standard suburban neighborhood in northern Ohio, where winters are genuinely brutal. We're talking temperatures that drop below zero with wind chill, roads that become skating rinks overnight, and the kind of dry, biting cold that makes your car door freeze shut even after you've already de-iced it twice. I knew what I was signing up for when I bought my house at 14 Birchwood Court, and I came prepared. My house has a covered front stoop, 3 steps leading up from the sidewalk to my front door. Those 3 steps get icy. I learned that the first winter I lived there, when a delivery driver slipped on the second step, caught himself on the railing, and still knocked out his coffee thermos, which skidded across my sidewalk and shattered. I felt terrible about it. The next morning I went to Morton's Hardware, grabbed a box of ice melt and a thick rubber mat designed specifically for winter use, the kind with deep grooves cut into the surface to grip boots and trap snow so it doesn't get dragged inside. I put the mat down, scattered some ice melt on the steps below it, and called it a day. For 3 winters, nobody said a single word to me about that mat. Then Darlene Caldwell got elected to the HOA board. Actually, elected is a generous word. What really happened was that the previous HOA president, a retired civil engineer named Harold Moss, stepped down because his wife got sick and he needed to focus on her care. Harold was the kind of HOA president who understood that his job was to maintain the neighborhood's common areas, make sure people weren't painting their houses neon orange, and otherwise stay out of everybody's business. He was good at it. People liked him. Under Harold, the HOA was genuinely useful. They organized snow removal for the shared driveway that connected 6 properties on the north end of the street, maintained the little decorative pond near the entrance, and kept the streetlights in working order. Fine, normal, good stuff. When Harold left, only 3 people showed up to the special election meeting, because it was held on a Tuesday night in November when most of the neighborhood was either busy or couldn't be bothered. One of those 3 people was Darlene Caldwell, who had been sitting on the board as secretary for about 2 years already, and who had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment. She nominated herself, seconded herself because the other 2 people in the room were confused about parliamentary procedure, and won the presidency by unanimous default. The other 2 just wanted to go home. Within 6 months, Darlene had hired a property management company called Apex Community Services to handle HOA enforcement. Here's the thing about Apex that I didn't know yet but would come to understand very clearly. They charged the HOA a flat fee plus a commission on every fine they collected. That second part is the important part. Every time Apex flagged a violation and collected a fine, they got a cut. So their entire business model was built around finding as many violations as possible and extracting as much money as they could from homeowners. They were, in the most honest possible terms, a shakedown operation dressed up in a polo shirt. Darlene loved them. They made her feel powerful, gave her official-looking paperwork, and handled all the actual work of sending notices and following up on complaints. For a woman who seemed to get genuine pleasure from telling her neighbors what they couldn't do, it was a perfect arrangement. But I didn't know any of this yet when she knocked on my door that January morning. The previous night we'd gotten about 8 inches of snow. I'd been out there at 6 a.m. with my shovel clearing the steps and the walk, chipping away at the ice underneath, and laying down a fresh scatter of ice melt on the steps. By the time I went back inside to make breakfast, the mat was sitting right where it always sat, collecting the slush off my boots, doing exactly what it was designed to do. I was on my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and there was Darlene. She was dressed like she was about to summit Everest despite being approximately 15 feet from her own warm car. Big puffy coat, fur-trimmed hood, gloves, the whole setup. She was holding a clipboard, which immediately told me this wasn't a casual neighbor visit. "Neil," she said, all brisk and businesslike, "I'm here representing the Maplewood Ridge HOA regarding a potential violation at your property." I looked at her. I looked at the clipboard. I looked down at my mat. "The mat," I said. "According to Section 7, subsection C of the Maplewood Ridge Community Standards, any exterior accessory or decorative item placed on the exterior of a homeowner's entryway, including but not limited to decorative items, planters, furniture, and floor coverings, must receive prior written approval from the HOA board before being installed." "It's a rubber mat," I said, "for safety, in a snowstorm." "I understand that, Neil, but the rules are the rules. You'll need to submit an ARC form, that's an Architectural Review Committee form, along with a product description, the dimensions, the color, and a photo, and the board will review it within 30 to 60 business days." I stared at her. 30 to 60 business days. That's standard review time. It's January, in Ohio. If I remove the mat while I wait 30 to 60 business days for approval, someone's going to fall on my steps. She gave me this very thin smile, the kind that's designed to look sympathetic while communicating the opposite. "I'm sure you can manage to keep your steps clear with ice melt and shoveling in the meantime. The mat needs to come up today or you'll receive a formal violation notice and a fine." "How much is the fine?" $50 per day. I stood there with my coffee mug getting cold in my hand, and I thought about Harold Moss, who would never in a million years have done this. Then I looked at Darlene, who had that clipboard tucked under her arm like she was issuing parking tickets outside a stadium, and I made a decision. "No," I said. She blinked. I don't think people said no to Darlene very often. "Excuse me. No, I'm not removing the mat. It's a safety item. It's preventing ice accumulation on my front steps in a snowstorm, and I'm not paying a fine for it." Darlene's thin smile disappeared entirely. "Neil, I'd strongly advise you to reconsider. The HOA has legal authority to assess fines and place liens on properties for violations." "You can send me whatever paperwork you'd like," I said. "Have a good morning, Darlene. Watch those steps, they're icy." And I closed the door. I won't pretend I was fully calm after that. I went to the kitchen and set down my coffee and spent about 5 minutes quietly furious. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and started doing what I should have done the moment Darlene joined the HOA board. I started actually reading the governing documents. Every HOA has them. There's the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, which is the big foundational document. Then there are the bylaws, which govern how the HOA itself operates. Then there are the rules and regulations, which can be amended more easily than the CC and RS, and are where most of the day-to-day stuff lives. When I bought my house, I got copies of all of these from the title company and stuffed them in a filing cabinet and never thought about them again, which is what most people do. That's exactly what HOA boards like Darlene's count on. I pulled them all out and started reading. My coffee got cold. I made more coffee. I kept reading. Here's what I found. Section 7, subsection C did exist, and it did say what Darlene said it said. Sort of. What she conveniently left out was the very next sentence, which read, Items placed temporarily for weather-related safety purposes, including but not limited to ice melt, sand, temporary stair grips, and safety matting, are exempt from ARC review requirements provided they are removed within 14 days following the end of the relevant weather event, 14 days after the snow cleared. My mat qualified as safety matting. It was a temporary weather safety item. There was literally an explicit exemption carved out for exactly what I was doing. I sat back in my chair and took a long sip of coffee and thought about whether Darlene had simply missed this language or had deliberately ignored it. I didn't have to think about it very long. I also found something else while I was in there. The bylaws had a provision about how fines could be levied. They couldn't just be created out of thin air by the board president. The full board had to vote on any fine schedule, and that vote had to be documented in meeting minutes that were available to homeowners upon request. Fines were also supposed to come with a 30-day cure period before they became payable, meaning even if I was in violation, I had 30 days to fix it before I owed a single dollar. Darlene had said the fine started accruing today. That wasn't how it worked. I also pulled up the Ohio Planned Community Act, which is the state law that governs HOAs in Ohio, and I found the relevant sections about enforcement procedures, homeowner rights, and the requirement that HOAs act in good faith. There was also a section about what happened when an HOA board member engaged in selective enforcement, meaning enforcing rules against some homeowners but not others. That last part gave me an idea. I put on my coat, pulled on my boots, and went for a walk around the neighborhood. It was still snowing lightly. Everything was quiet and white and actually quite beautiful if you ignored the fact that I'd just been threatened with a $50 a day fine for a rubber mat. I walked slowly, and I paid attention to people's front doors. 3 houses down from mine, Dave and Linda Kowalski, had a giant decorative wreath on their front door that had been there since October. The CC and RS said exterior decorations had to come down within a certain number of days after the relevant holiday. That wreath had been up for going on 4 months now. 5 houses past that, the Nuyens had a beautiful set of potted evergreen shrubs flanking their front door, in decorative ceramic pots. Those hadn't gone anywhere in winter, and I was pretty sure ceramic pots placed permanently on an entryway would fall squarely under Section 7 subsection C as exterior accessories requiring ARC approval. I had certainly never seen an ARC approval notice posted anywhere for those pots. And right across the street from the Nuyens, sitting in front of 22 Birchwood Court, which happened to be Darlene Caldwell's own house, was a large decorative wooden sled propped against the wall beside her front door. It was painted red. It had a Christmas bow on it. It had been there since before Thanksgiving. I stopped on the sidewalk in front of her house and looked at that sled for a long moment. Then I took out my phone and took a photograph. I walked the rest of the neighborhood and documented 11 separate items on 11 different front stoops that I was fairly confident would require ARC approval under the rule Darlene was trying to enforce against me. I photographed all of them. I noted the addresses. I went home and started a spreadsheet. 2 days later, I got the official violation notice in the mail. It was on Apex Community Services letterhead, which I thought was interesting because I would have expected it on HOA letterhead. It stated that I was in violation of Section 7 subsection C of the Maplewood Ridge Community Standards, that a fine of $50 per day was accruing immediately, and that failure to pay could result in a lien being placed on my property. It also had a small print note at the bottom that said fines were payable directly to Apex Community Services, payable directly to Apex, not to the HOA. To Apex. I stared at that line for a long time. I picked up the phone and called Tom Beatty, who lives at the end of Birchwood Court and who happens to be a real estate attorney. We'd had beers together at neighborhood cookouts a few times, and I knew what he did for a living. I'd never needed to call him in a professional capacity before, but here we were. Tom answered on the second ring, heard me out, and was quiet for about 4 seconds before he said, Wait, the fines go directly to the management company. That's what it says on the notice. That's not how that's supposed to work. HOA fines are supposed to go into HOA operating funds. If they're going directly to Apex, that's either a serious accounting irregularity or it's outright fraud. Can you scan me that notice? I scanned it and emailed it to him within about 5 minutes. He called back 20 minutes after that. Okay, he said, and I could hear that his voice had changed, gotten sharper. So this is actually quite serious. First of all, you've got a clear exemption in the CC and RS that she apparently ignored. Second, fines going directly to a third-party management company with no pass-through to the HOA operating account is a major red flag. Third, I'd like to know if the other homeowners in this neighborhood have been receiving similar notices and whether anyone has actually been paying these fines. How do I find that out? You're entitled to request HOA financial records under Ohio law. Every homeowner is. Submit a written request to the board for copies of the financial statements, the fine ledger, and the management agreement with Apex. They have to provide them within a reasonable time. If they refuse or stonewall, that's another violation. I sent the records request that same afternoon via certified mail so I'd have proof of delivery. I sent it to the HOA's registered address, which was a P.O. box, and I also sent a copy directly to Darlene's house address. Meanwhile, the mat stayed, right where it was. The snow was relentless that January. We got 2 more storms in the following week, and every morning I was out there shoveling and scattering ice melt, and my mat was doing its job. I also put a small security camera on my front doorbell mount, one of those video doorbells that records everything. I'd been meaning to get one for a while. This seemed like a good time to install it. About a week and a half after I'd sent the records request, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, it wasn't Darlene this time. It was my neighbor across the street, a woman named Patricia Chen, and she looked upset. "Neil," she said, "did you get a violation notice from the HOA?" "I did, about my snow mat of all things." She held up an envelope. "I got one too, about my window box. I've had that window box for 3 years and suddenly it's a violation." Behind her, coming up my front walk, was Marcus Webb from 2 doors down, also holding an envelope. "They say my garage door color is wrong," he said, sounding baffled. "I painted it the same color it was when I moved in." Over the next 48 hours, I heard from 5 different neighbors who had all received violation notices from Apex in the past 2 weeks. Different violations, all of them minor, all of them things those neighbors had been doing for years without complaint. The fines ranged from $30 to $75 per day. Every single notice directed payment to Apex Community Services. We all gathered at Tom Beatty's house on a Thursday evening. It was -8 degrees outside with wind chill. The roads were glazed with ice, and about 9 of us crammed into Tom's living room with hot coffee and the various notice letters laid out on his dining room table. Tom walked us through what he'd found since our initial call. He'd done some digging on Apex Community Services, and what he found was not reassuring. They'd been the management company for 3 other HOAs in the greater Cleveland area over the past 5 years. In 2 of those cases, homeowners had filed complaints with the Ohio Attorney General's office about improper fine collection practices. In one case, there had been a civil lawsuit that Apex settled out of court. They had a pattern. "This is what I think is happening," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "Apex gets paid a flat fee for management services, but they've also set up an arrangement where fines go directly to them rather than to the HOA. They then may or may not be remitting a portion back to the HOA. The key question is whether the HOA board, meaning Darlene, actually authorized this arrangement and whether she's getting any personal benefit from it." "Like a kickback?" Marcus asked. "I'm not using that word yet because I don't have evidence of it, but it's a question worth asking. The management agreement between the HOA and Apex should spell out the financial arrangement." "That's one of the documents Neil requested. They haven't responded to my records request yet, I said. It's been 12 days. Ohio law generally gives them 30 days for financial records. We're not there yet, but I want to flag that we should all submit individual records requests, not just Neil. If 9 of us submit simultaneous requests, they can't bury it as easily. We drafted template letters right there at the table. Tom printed them. We all signed our own copies, and we agreed to send them via certified mail the next morning. 9 simultaneous records requests, all asking for the same documents: financial statements, fine ledger, the Apex Management Agreement, and board meeting minutes for the past 18 months. While we were all at Tom's house, I pulled up my spreadsheet on my phone and shared it with the group. 11 front stoops with unapproved exterior items, including Darlene's wooden sled, which was still sitting in front of her door despite the fact that we were well into January and the relevant holiday had ended 3 weeks ago. She hasn't received a violation notice, Patricia said, stating the obvious. Because she's the one sending them, Marcus said. That's selective enforcement, Tom said, which is actionable under both the HOA's own governing documents and state law. If she's enforcing rules against some homeowners and not others, including herself, that's a problem for her. I had one more thing to add. I'd gone back through the meeting minutes that were posted on the HOA's website, which was a sad-looking thing that Darlene had apparently set up herself using a free website builder. The minutes were sparse and often vague, but I'd found something interesting in the minutes from the previous May. The board had voted 3-2 to enter into the management agreement with Apex. Darlene had voted yes. The 2 other board members who voted yes were named Gerald Finch and Susan Alvarez. Tom did a quick search on his laptop and found that Gerald Finch was the brother-in-law of the founder of Apex Community Services. They shared the same last name as Apex's founder's wife. It wasn't hidden information. It just hadn't been disclosed to the board before the vote. That's a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed, Tom said quietly. And if Darlene knew about it and didn't disclose it either, that complicates things significantly. We wrapped up around 10:30 that night and drove home on roads that were still icy and treacherous from the latest round of freezing temperatures. I sat in my driveway for a minute after I turned the car off, looking at the snow-covered street and thinking about how a rubber mat had managed to unravel what looked like a pretty significant scheme. The following 2 weeks were a waiting game, and winter was absolutely not cooperating with anyone's mood. We got another 6 inches of snow. My furnace decided this was an excellent time to start making a grinding noise, and the road in front of my house had an ice patch that had already sent 2 cars fishtailing through the intersection. The city had been slow to sand it. Everything was frozen and difficult and irritating, which was not exactly a helpful backdrop for trying to deal with an HOA situation with patience. The mat stayed at my door. The fine notices kept coming from Apex. I documented every single one and forwarded copies to Tom. By the end of January, I was theoretically on the hook for nearly $800 in fines, all of them completely invalid given the exemption in the CC and RS that Darlene had pretended didn't exist. My doorbell camera had already captured some useful footage. The day after Darlene's first visit, Apex sent a property inspector out to photograph my mat. I watched the footage, and what I saw was a guy in a jacket that said Apex on the back taking photos not just of my property but walking slowly down the entire street, photographing front doors, Patricia's window box, Marcus's garage, the Nguyen's ceramic pots. But then, clearly visible on the footage, he got to Darlene's house, looked at the wooden sled by her door, stood there for about 15 seconds and then kept walking without photographing it. I clipped that footage and sent it to Tom. "Oh, that's interesting," he said when I called him. "That's actually very helpful." At the 30-day mark, the HOA had still not produced the financial documents. Tom sent a follow-up letter on his official law firm letterhead, citing the relevant Ohio statutes, and setting a final deadline of 10 business days. He also referenced the footage of the apex inspector, engaged in apparent selective enforcement of the property inspection. The tone of his letter was polite and factual, and it must have landed like a bucket of ice water because we got a response within 48 hours. The response came from a lawyer. Not Darlene herself, not even Apex, but an actual attorney retained by the HOA, a man named Glenn Farris from a firm in the next town over. His letter was full of formal language about how the HOA was fully compliant with all applicable statutes, and that any alleged violations of the community standards were properly assessed and not subject to homeowner challenge. He made no mention of the exemption clause I'd cited. He also did not produce any of the requested financial documents, citing a claimed exception for deliberative process that Tom later told me was legally nonsensical in this context. "They're stalling," Tom said. "Which means there's something in those documents they don't want us to see. We filed a complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section. Tom handled the drafting. We submitted every notice letter, the documented exemption language from the CC and RS, the doorbell camera footage of selective enforcement, the evidence of the conflict of interest in the Apex vote, and the fact that fines were being directed to Apex rather than to the HOA. We made it as complete and well documented as we could. 9 homeowners signed the complaint." While we waited on the AG's office, Tom also filed a motion in the local county court for an emergency injunction to stop the accrual of fines pending a judicial determination of whether the fines were valid. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Harriet Park, issued a temporary restraining order within 3 days, pausing all fine accrual and collection activity by both the HOA and Apex pending the hearing. When Apex got served with the TRO, things moved quickly. Gerald Finch, the board member who was related to Apex's founder, resigned from the HOA board within 24 hours of service. He sent a terse resignation letter that said he was resigning to focus on personal matters, which is the universal language for "I can see exactly where this is going." That left the board short-handed and created a governance problem that Tom was happy to point out in his subsequent filings. The full hearing on the injunction was scheduled for mid-February. By then, winter had settled in with the particular grim determination that only the Midwest can manage, the kind of cold where your car needs to warm up for 15 minutes before you can safely drive it, where the furnace runs almost continuously, and where you become irrationally resentful of people in warmer climates posting beach photos on social media. I'd also finally gotten my furnace fixed, which set me back a few $100s that I was now in a particularly bad mood about given the ongoing HOA situation. The February hearing was where things really broke open. Tom had subpoenaed Apex's financial records as part of the court process. What those records showed was startling. Over the 18 months since Apex had taken over management of Maplewood Ridge HOA, they had collected approximately $42,000 in fines from homeowners throughout the neighborhood. Of that $42,000, $8,000 had been remitted to the HOA operating account. The remaining $34,000 had stayed with Apex. But that wasn't the part that made Judge Park's expression go flat and serious. The part that did that was the documentation showing that Darlene Caldwell had received a monthly consulting fee from Apex Community Services of $350 per month, paid to a personal account, for the entire 18 months of the management agreement. A total of $6,300. This was never disclosed to the HOA board, never disclosed to homeowners, and never documented in any meeting minutes. It was a direct personal financial benefit derived from her position as HOA president, paid by the very company she had voted to hire. In the state of Ohio, that's not just an HOA violation. That's a potential criminal matter involving breach of fiduciary duty and potentially fraud. Judge Park did not rule from the bench that day. She took the matter under advisement, extended the TRO, and referred the financial misconduct evidence to the county prosecutor's office. I drove home from the courthouse through heavy snow and gray skies, and I remember feeling something I can only describe as a kind of exhausted satisfaction, the way you feel after you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. The criminal referral moved faster than I expected, probably because the documentation was so clean and the pattern was so clear. The Apex founder, a man named Dennis Fitch, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. He laid out the entire arrangement, which had been running not just in Maplewood Ridge, but in 2 other HOA communities where Apex held management contracts. The consulting fee payments to HOA board members were a standard part of his business model. He called them relationship fees in his internal documents, which investigators found darkly funny. Darlene Caldwell was charged with breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of HOA funds. Gerald Finch, the other board member with the Apex connection, was charged separately as a co-conspirator. The charges were filed in late February, and both of them were arrested on a Tuesday morning that happened to be, with great dramatic symmetry, one of the snowiest days of the year. Darlene was taken from her home in handcuffs, past the decorative wooden sled that was still sitting by her front door, still wearing its Christmas bow, still in violation of the very rules she'd been using to terrorize her neighbors. I heard about the arrest from Patricia Chen, who texted me at about 9 in the morning. I was at my kitchen table with coffee, and when I read her message, I sat there for a moment and then looked out the window at the snow coming down, and felt something unwind in my chest that had been coiled tight for weeks. The criminal process took several months to work through the system, which is normal. Darlene ultimately pleaded guilty to 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty and received a suspended sentence along with an order to repay the $6,300 she'd received from Apex, plus a fine of equal amount. She was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state of Ohio as a condition of her plea agreement. Gerald Finch received a similar outcome. Apex Community Services surrendered their management licenses and dissolved rather than face the full civil litigation. Their founder, Dennis Fitch, paid a substantial settlement to the homeowners in 3 affected communities, including Maplewood Ridge. Our neighborhood's share of that settlement was used to replenish the HOA operating fund and to cover a portion of the legal costs the 9 of us had collectively incurred. At the civil court level, Judge Park ruled that all of the fines levied under the Apex Management Agreement were void and unenforceable. Every homeowner who had paid fines to Apex received a refund. Between the Apex settlement and the fine refunds, some neighbors who had been quietly paying notices for over a year got back several $1,000s. Tom Beatty was elected the new HOA president at a special meeting in March, after the snow had finally started to ease, and the first tentative signs of approaching spring were making people slightly more optimistic about everything. He ran on a platform of actually reading the documents before enforcing them, and won unanimously, mostly because nobody else wanted the job, but also because everyone genuinely trusted him. Under Tom, the HOA restructured completely. They hired a new management company, this one with a completely transparent fee structure, no commission on fines, and a contract that required them to disclose any financial relationships with board members. The fine schedule was revised to include proper notice periods, clear appeal procedures, and a blanket exemption that made crystal clear what I'd found in the original CC and RS. Safety items placed for weather-related purposes were not subject to architectural review. Tom actually added language specifically mentioning snow mats, sandbags, and ice melt containers, just to be absolutely bulletproof about it. At the first full community meeting of the new board, Tom stood up in front of about 30 neighbors crammed into his living room and formally acknowledged that the original enforcement action against me had been improper and conducted in bad faith. He said it clearly on the record, with the meeting being recorded. Several people applauded. Marcus Webb called out about time, and there was general laughter. I sat in a folding chair next to Patricia Chen and felt genuinely good about things in a way I hadn't in a while. But before we get to the ending, I want to back up and tell you about some of the things that happened in the middle of all this, because the story of a neighborhood fighting back isn't just about attorneys and court filings. It's also about the smaller, more human moments that happened while the big machinery of justice was slowly turning. About 3 weeks after my initial confrontation with Darlene, in the deepest cold stretch of that January, Marcus Webb's heating system failed. Not just a grinding noise like mine had made, but a full failure, the kind where the repair company tells you it can't be fixed, only replaced, and the earliest installation appointment is 4 days away. Marcus had a 7-year-old daughter and his house was dropping below 50 degrees. I found out about it because I was coming home from the hardware store and saw Marcus outside in the cold talking on his phone looking stressed. I pulled over and asked what was going on, and when he told me I didn't even have to think about it. "Bring Lily and come stay with me," I said. "I've got a guest room and the furnace works." He looked at me like I just said something in a foreign language, and then he thanked me about 4 times too many and went inside to pack some things. That week, while the repair company scrambled to get his new system installed, Marcus and his daughter Lily stayed in my guest room. Lily thought the snow mat at my front door was the greatest invention ever made because of the pattern the grooves left on the snow she tracked in. She kept deliberately stepping on it over and over to look at the marks. It became a small daily ritual for her every morning before school. I cannot tell you how much that small thing mattered to me during a period when I was dealing with certified mail and court filings and legal strategy. A 7-year-old making footprint patterns on a rubber mat. Proof that the mat was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, in exactly the way it was supposed to do it. Patricia Chen, meanwhile, had her own HOA war going on in parallel to mine. The violation notice about her window box had been the latest in a series of increasingly petty complaints she'd received over the past several months. She'd gotten a notice about a wind chime, one about the specific color of her mailbox post, and one about the height of a decorative border she'd installed in her front garden. She'd been paying the fines because she didn't know she didn't have to, because the notices looked official and threatening, and she was a single woman who'd moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago and didn't know anyone well enough to push back. When she found out through our group that all those fines had gone straight to Apex, and that Apex had been paying Darlene a personal consulting fee, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "So I was literally paying for someone to harass me." And the anger in her voice was completely justified. Patricia had paid approximately $1,200 in fines over 8 months. She got all of it back from the Apex settlement. She used part of it to buy a genuinely magnificent new window box that she filled with evergreen cuttings and winter berries, and which looked beautiful all winter long, and nobody said a word about it except to compliment her on it. There's also the matter of what happened with Darlene's neighbors, specifically the Garcias at number 18, right next door to Darlene. They had received a violation notice about a basketball hoop in their driveway, which their teenage son used daily. The hoop was fully retractable, sat on their own property, and had been there for 2 years. The violation notice had arrived the same week their son won a junior league championship with his team. When the Garcia family heard the full scope of what Darlene and Apex had been doing, Mr. Garcia submitted a letter to the county prosecutor's office describing how the violation notice had affected his family. He described having to explain to his 14-year-old son why the basketball hoop might have to come down, and how his son had cried, genuinely cried, because that hoop was where he practiced every day and had been since he was 12. That letter, according to Tom, who had a contact in the prosecutor's office, was part of what pushed the decision to pursue the criminal charges rather than just the civil resolution. A rubber mat, a window box, a basketball hoop, a wind chime. These are the things Darlene Caldwell tried to weaponize against her own neighbors for personal financial gain. And none of us knew, for too long, that it was happening. There's a lesson in there about reading your HOA documents, and I say that as someone who didn't read them for 3 years. There's a lesson about the importance of knowing your neighbors, because without Marcus and Patricia and Tom and everyone else, we wouldn't have had the weight to push back effectively. And there's a lesson about what happens when power gets handed to people who are motivated by greed and control, rather than community service. But let me tell you about the last thing that happened, because it's the thing that actually brought the whole story to a close in a way that felt genuinely satisfying rather than just legally resolved. It was April by then. The snow was gone, finally and completely. The first crocuses were coming up in Patricia's garden bed. Marcus's new heating system had been running perfectly since February, and he'd had me over for dinner twice to say thank you, which was entirely unnecessary but also very good, because Marcus is an excellent cook. Lily had started calling me Mr. Neil with the mat, which I considered a fine honorific. Tom had just finished the first full community meeting of the reorganized HOA board. The new rules had been formally adopted, the fine structure had been overhauled, and the new management company had sent a liaison who sat through the whole meeting taking notes and asking sensible questions. It felt like a neighborhood that was finally governing itself the way it was supposed to. After the meeting, I walked home through the April evening. The street was quiet. The lights in all the houses were warm and orange. The last of the ice that had clung to the north-facing side of the road had finally melted away. Spring was actually arriving. I got to my front door and looked down. My rubber mat was still there. I'd been keeping it through April because we'd had one late cold snap and I didn't see any reason to put it away just yet. It had been sitting in that same spot for months now, through all of it. The harassment, the fine notices, the court filing, the arrests, the settlement, the reorganization. It had been witness to the whole thing in its own quiet, rubber way. I picked it up, turned it over, looked at the bottom. $12 from Morton's Hardware. Deep grooves designed to trap snow and mud. Simple, functional, unapologetic. I thought about Darlene standing on my stoop in her enormous coat, telling me this mat needed 30 to 60 business days of board approval before it could legally exist. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I put the mat back down, because there was one more cold night in the forecast, and I still believed in being practical. And I went inside. Over the following spring and summer, Maplewood Ridge actually became a genuinely pleasant neighborhood to live in. Tom organized the first real community get-together the HOA had held in years, a barbecue in the common area near the decorative pond. About 40 people showed up. Marcus brought his legendary potato salad. Patricia brought wine. The Garcia's son demonstrated his basketball skills in the driveway while his parents watched with the kind of relaxed pride that's only possible when nobody is threatening to fine you for it. Darlene Caldwell didn't appear. She'd sold her house in March, shortly after the guilty plea, and moved to a condo somewhere on the other side of the county. Nobody mentioned her by name at the barbecue. There was nothing to say about her, really. She had tried to turn a neighborhood into a profit engine and a personal fiefdom, and it hadn't worked. The wooden sled had been removed from her porch by whoever cleaned out the house for sale. The Christmas bow was gone. The stoop was bare. By the time the following winter arrived, I was ready for it. I'd stocked up on ice melt in October. I had a good snow shovel with an ergonomic handle that my back appreciated, and my furnace had been serviced and pronounced fully healthy. When the first real snowfall came in December, I shoveled my steps, scattered ice melt, and placed my rubber mat in front of my door without filling out a single form, without waiting 30 to 60 business days for board approval, and without receiving any notices threatening fines. It sat there, doing its job, the same as it always had. The neighborhood stayed quiet and good. The new HOA did exactly what an HOA is supposed to do: maintained the shared spaces, kept the pond looking nice, organized the occasional community event, and left everyone's rubber mats entirely alone. Tom handled board business with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that his job was to serve the community, not to control it. Occasionally, I'd be outside shoveling, and a neighbor would wave from across the street, or someone would slow down their car to ask about the ice on the corner, or Lily Garcia would come by on her way home from school and step deliberately on my mat to make the pattern, and then grin at me like she was getting away with something. Those moments, small and unremarkable and genuinely wonderful, are what a neighborhood is actually supposed to feel like. It started with a rubber mat and a woman with a clipboard who thought she had all the power. It ended with a community that had found its footing, held onto it, and wasn't going to let go. The mat never moved.